Nonfiction, close reading, and bias. The rhetorical reality. So over the last few years, we've seen a lot of news stations and media talking about fake news or what's real and what's considered truth or not. So in this PowerPoint or Google slide, we will be talking mostly about how to look at something and see if it's real, see if it's truthful. How can we make sense of these various messages and determine which is the most logical? When we read, view, listen to various sources, how can we make sure that we are taking in truth? What is even true? How can we be a mindful listener and critical thinker? And how can we spot biases or fallacies in others as well as ourselves, especially when it comes to controversial topics? Nonfiction summary versus nonfiction evaluation. So a summary of a source, what are the text's central ideas? What information does a source provide? Overall, students are really good at summarizing any information they see. It's the evaluation part that takes a little bit more in-depth knowledge and research. The evaluating a source, so who wrote it? Who is the speaker? Why was the information given? What is the occasion of the piece? Why is the information presented and organized in this way? Who is the intended audience? What is the purpose of this information? What appeals, so ethos, pathos, and logos, were used to help achieve the author's purpose? What is said and what is not said or ignored completely, and what biases are present? The analysis of a source, so how does a text support these ideas? So consider the rhetorical triangle when evaluating sources. So you have ethos, which is the speaker, you have the message, which is the logos, and you have the audience, which is the pathos. And then kind of in that middle of that triangle is the context of the speech. So you are always asking yourself, is this valid? So the quality of being logically or factually sound. Is this logical and does it make sense? Reliable is the quality of being trustworthy or performing consistently well. So should I trust this information and does this person have strong ethos in this topic? Relevant, the quality or state of being closely connected or appropriate. Does this even matter to the overall topic and how does it connect? And is it sufficient? An adequate amount of something, especially of something essential. Is there enough evidence to prove that this makes sense? Bias and cognitive bias. So one thing you have probably heard over the last 4 years or however long you've been watching any type of news station, you talk about bias and everybody having their own opinion. The first thing I want to make note is that everybody has a bias. So even if you don't think you do, more than likely you do. But being aware that you do is the biggest part of understanding how to become more neutral in your understanding and presentation of facts. So a bias is a subjective way of thinking that tells only one side of a story, sometimes leading to inaccurate information or a false impression. An example of think of when you got in a fight with maybe a sibling or a friend and an adult had said, I want to hear both sides of the story. My mom would say, I want to hear both sides of the story so she could get a non-biased view of what actually happened. So again, everyone has bias, not just writers. Readers have their own biases that they also bring to an issue, an idea, a reading, a source. Bias is a side effect of having opinions and growing up in various environments. So again, we all grew up so differently. Our ages make a big difference. You have bias that maybe I don't, and vice versa. So a cognitive bias is a mistake in reasoning, evaluating, remembering, or other cognitive process, often occurring as a result of holding on to one's preferences and beliefs regardless of contrary information. Biases or bias cannot be excused, so it's up to a good writer to find a way to harness or suppress it. It can also mark of a good reader to spot it and question it in a source, but also address their own personal biases when evaluating information. So always being aware of who that speaker is or who the person reading the book, or even you as the writer, not to have a bias. It is very hard, but it is possible to remain unbiased. One of two types of cognitive bias is anchoring bias. So relying too much on the first piece of information you learn of or hear. So the example is below. I'll have you read that on your own. The second one is blind spot a bias, recognizing bias in others, but failing to recognize it in yourself. And a really good example is #OKBoomer. So seeing that issue or that bias in older people, but not so much in yourself. Negativity bias is focusing on negative events at the expense of positive or neutral events. So example, people tend to be more motivated to vote against a candidate because of the negative information than they are to vote for a candidate because of positive information. Again, we went through all of this recently in our history in America with voting for your candidate. Types of cognitive bias are also outcome bias, so judging or evaluating a decision based solely on the outcome. An example, a person continuing to play slots could result in winning a large amount of money prevents that person from leaving the casino. A confirmation bias is listening to and trusting only information that confirms your bias. So consider the most dangerous cognitive bias. So example, conservatives and Republicans only listening to conservative media, and Democrats and liberals only listening to liberal media sources. I know that in my own life, I make sure I look at all three. So a conservative, a Democrat, and kind of that neutral source to see what information is actually true. So I go between all three of them as I look for information to be factual. Cognitive bias, confirmation bias, so most used, most dangerous. We have heard fake news presented to us the last few years, and it's kind of come forward as being something that people don't want to hear or don't want to deal with. So answer the questions in your notes, 1 through 4. What do people do when experiencing confirmation bias? What don't they do? Does confirmation bias rely more on the reasoning part of your brain or the emotional part of your brain? Is there anything good about confirmation bias? Why is it important to research the facts of your own side and the other side to fight confirmation bias? So answer those questions in your notes after you have watched the fake news clip above. If you want more detailed overview of additional bias, you can watch the cognitive bias explained video on your right. So what you will be doing is I will read the top portion in black and you will be answering if or what bias is present. So what bias is present in this? An interview with the new mayor focuses on his DUI 25 years ago rather than his work as a doctor. So in your notes, go back, see what bias is present, and write it down. What bias is present? Your mom thinks Pluto is a planet, though it was downgraded to a dwarf planet in 2006. What bias is present? Your friend didn't study for the math test, but ended up with a B. Now she's not going to study for the final. What bias is present? Your ice cream loving friend has an obvious bias against popsicles. So ridiculous. Popsicles are the best. What bias is present? Who would ever be opposed to free college tuition? Certainly no one you'd ever pay attention to. What bias is present? Now, let's get to work. You have practiced on your own. You have taken the notes on this PowerPoint. Use the notes and focus on what you will be doing next. So what is it? You're going to do a bias activity. Where is it? It's on Google Classroom under the Classwork tab in your specific Google Classroom. And when? Right now. For this exercise, just state if the statement is biased or factual. No need for stating which type of bias is present, if any. Just B for bias and F for fact.